so, I mean, we approach this issue as an advocate, and we're advocates for renewable energy and energy conservation and, you know, the environment in general. So we don't really look at this as, you know, one issue and one issue only. We look at it pretty comprehensively and in a lot of different contexts. And I think, you know, that's just important to do. So I wanted to just make sure that it was clear that that's kind of where we were coming from. So we talk about energy and our energy future as a balance between how we make it and how we use it. And I think when we're talking about, you know, wind energy, it's also important to be out there talking about conservation and efficiency and all of the techniques and strategies that we can employ to be saving electricity and saving energy and not, you know, increasing demand as we move forward. We heard earlier that, you know, overall energy demand is increasing by about 2% per year, but there's a lot that we can be doing on the demand side to kind of curb that. So that's something that we should keep in mind. We've talked a lot today, obviously, about why we need wind energy, why it makes sense. These are just, I think, to serve as reminders for all of us as advocates as we're out there educating the public and talking to our colleagues and our friends about, you know, what the advantages are with this type of energy production. Every energy production has impact. There's no question about that. It's really just a matter of sort of talking about it in context. So with wind energy, we don't have air pollution. We don't have carbon issues. We don't use a lot of water. We're not impacting water in a negative way as we're producing the energy. And we don't have these price escalation issues with fuel. Obviously, we've talked a lot again today about the job growth and economic development potential. Just to give you some perspective, in Pennsylvania in the past year, we have had a lower unemployment rate than the national average. And a big reason why that has been the case is because the clean tech sector in Pennsylvania has been growing quite a bit. And so that has helped to kind of keep the unemployment rate a little bit lower. Looking again at just energy in context, it's important to say that, you know, all forms of energy production have subsidies, right? And traditional forms of energy production have a heck of a lot more than wind energy. So I'm trying to just sort of present, as we kind of move into this, some of the kinds of things that, you know, are sort of swirling out there in the ether that people argue with you about when you're talking about wind or energy in general. There are a host of impacts, negative impacts from traditional fossil fuel generation. This is just in particular looking at coal. Pennsylvania is a big coal state, so we deal with that a lot. You know, acid rain, soot, and fine particle pollution causing asthma and other chronic respiratory problems, cardiopulmonary problems, premature deaths. Just in my county alone, in Pennsylvania, over the past 10 years, there have been studies that have recently come out that have documented more than 14,000 premature deaths attributable directly to coal fire generation, just in our county, which is in where Pittsburgh is located. So, you know, that's a big deal. And it's the kind of external cost that is, you know, sort of impossible to really get your arms around and isn't, you know, always part of this discussion when we're talking about, you know, cents per megawatt hour or whatever. Wind energy, obviously very different from coal in terms of things like mercury, which has major impacts on human health, potentially, but also a lot of impacts on wildlife. When you're talking about the full coal cycle, you can't discount the impacts that go along with coal mining, including including loss of natural streams and other forms of habitat, drinking water damage, property damage, a long legacy of abandoned coal mines which have left Pennsylvania in particular dealing with acid mine pollution problems, the loss of tax revenues from areas that have coal mining, literally communities that disappear because the mining companies buy up hundreds and hundreds of properties to avoid having to mitigate for the damages that occur from the mining activities, deaths in the mine, noise, mine truck damage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the global warming impacts, the climate change impacts that we're seeing play out. Just to give you a vivid example, studies have predicted that the climate that we experience in Pittsburgh right now, where I live, in a few decades will feel like Alabama, which maybe in Virginia that doesn't sound as dramatic as it sounds to me being in Pittsburgh, but literally predicted to have dozens of days over 100 degrees in the summer, which is pretty remarkable. And obviously there are then a lot of collateral impacts, costs that go along with those climate changes. Our skiing and angling and fall foliage and sugar maple industries, which are really important in many states like Pennsylvania, are at risk. Literally people dying from heat stroke, pests, disease vectors, flooding, kind of all of these different costs, again, associated with this sort of thing. It's interesting, as we were listening to the presentation about the bird and bat impacts, just to think a little bit about what global warming impacts will be on bird species and wildlife. The World Wildlife Federation predicts that climate change will result in bird extinction rates of up to 72% over the next 70 years or so. So, it's a big deal how we get our energy. These are just some visuals of sort of power plants and traditional forms of energy production. When we hear a lot of discussion in opposition to erecting wind turbines and what that's going to do to a view shed, or what that's going to do to a landscape, a lot of people just don't have a clear idea in their mind about what the alternative looks like, and it's not very pretty. This picture is of a stream bed in southwest PA, pretty close to where I live, which has been permanently dewatered from coal mining, undermining, from longwall mining, where the machinery just literally takes all of the coal in its path, and as it moves along, everything above ground subsides. And in Pennsylvania, the law allows for this to happen, and basically, requires for structures that the impacts be mitigated, but there's not really a prohibition on causing this kind of damage, and what the long-term cumulative impacts of stream destruction and habitat loss and water loss are in areas that have this kind of activity going on, are very poorly understood and rarely thought about in the discussion. So there's actually, I just wanted to mention too, there's a recent study that came out about 2 months ago on the life cycle of coal that was from a collaborative of researchers at a variety of universities. It's extremely comprehensive and kind of looks at it from every angle, and I'll try to dig that out and send it to you so that we can circulate that. It's pretty impressive, pretty disturbing. So I think just with this slide, the bottom line here is that if we're generating electricity from wind, we're generating less from fossil fuels, hopefully, and that's really the PJM, our grid, back in 2007, we did an interview with them, and I think this is a really impressive statement. You know, wind generators have very low operating costs, so every time wind electricity is generated and goes onto the grid, that electricity is used. It's included in the supply, so it's important. If it's not coming from wind, then it's coming from something else, and that something else is probably a heck of a lot worse. So again, just to repeat, I think it's really important to approach this in a way that we're acknowledging that we do need to address electricity demand, that it's not just about, you know, how we produce it, but that we should be saving it. And both energy efficiency and renewable energy are compatible, and both are really necessary, and they go hand in hand. So as, you know, you're looking in Virginia and elsewhere about, you know, kind of how to promote renewable energy, I think, and I'm ignorant of what's going on around energy conservation, and I'm sure there's a lot going on there too, but it's important to sort of say, you know, that you get that there are two sides to the coin. So I thought it would be fun to sort of go into some of the details of anti-wind arguments, and I would love it if people just wanted to shout out some of the crazy stuff that they've heard, because it gets pretty outrageous and outlandish, but they kind of fall into a variety of different categories, so we'll kind of run through some of these things. And we can go into this in a little bit more detail, but you know, these are just common criticisms. So, you know, wind's not reliable because it's not always good. Why should we do wind? Because, you know, we have to apply all these government subsidies to it. You know, wind farms cause health problems. All right, so safety concerns. Turbines throw massive ice shards off of them. I've heard this argument a number of times where people basically have this idea that there are these like giant spikes of ice that come soaring off of the turbine and, you know, spear into your front window. As Courtney described, the setback requirements that, you know, that we talk a lot about provide adequate protection, and, you know, ice buildup is a pretty slow process, doesn't just appear magically, and if there is a lot of ice buildup, turbines have the ability to shut down so that this kind of thing doesn't really happen. You know, turbines can collapse. I mean, yes, that is a very minor risk, but one that could occur. But these things are engineered to withstand all sorts of hurricane force winds, etc. Turbines cause epilepsy. This is untrue. They usually are spinning at frequencies too low to trigger epileptic seizures. There's been an actual book that's come out on, quote, wind turbine syndrome that was published